Hi. Sponsored by Bubbly Pineapple Coconut. Gonna read more scary stories. We're on South Carolina. Story tonight, Edisto Island, which is where we were on our Rambler trip. I should have thought of this to read when we were there. That would have been spooky, wouldn't it? Everybody would have went crazy. Here we go. You guys ready? Ready. Anybody watching in a replay? Welcome. And I hope these stories help you sleep. Maybe they will, just out of sheer boredom. In any event, they would have done their job. Okay, let's get started. Get my little holder, my phone holder. I know it's right here. Here we go. Everybody laughs at my zebra. I used to have a unicorn, a purple one, and it broke. Luckily, Walmart had another one, and I went and got it. It's a zebra, black and white. Let me put this in the holder. Hope the TV's not too loud. Hey, Denise, how you doing? Where's my Alicia Biso? Yeah. Let me get there. Get to my story. Well, good. I'm glad you're glad. I'm glad that you came in. Let me get to my story. That's the test. You hear that? Okay. Chapter 4 out of spooky South Carolina. Good, Denise. I'm glad. Okay. I hope the TV's not too loud. The man is back home. The 13th step, Edisto Island. Amelia was a happy child, growing up during the 1720s in a grand brick house owned by her aunt and uncle. She and her cousins roamed the island, crabbing and fishing, rowing and swimming. Oh, not talking about shelling yet, though, are they? Amelia loved to climb trees, her long skirts bundled up around her knees. And she would listen for hours to the stories of her best friend, Concha, one of the Native American boys living on the island. Concha had a special connection to the creatures of the woods and the air, and he knew the sea as if its waters flowed in his veins instead of blood. He was a frequent playmate of Amelia and her cousins, but Amelia in particular was his special friend. It was not long before Amelia's aunt brought her indoors and started the long task of teaching the tomboy to become a lady. But her aunt was a good soul who sometimes turned a blind eye when a bird call sounded from the woods nearby, and Amelia hastened away from her school books and etiquette lessons to roam the island with her friend Concha. The world rotated on its axis a few more times, and suddenly Amelia was a woman grown. Her 18th birthday marked her debut into the local society, and invitations were given to all the prominent families of the island and to many living in nearby Charlestown. Amelia donned a lovely evening dress with hooped skirts and an off-the-shoulder bodice that she found rather daring. As she drew on her long white gloves, she heard the familiar bird call from the woods. It was her friend Concha calling to her. Amelia was flustered and embarrassed when she heard Concha's summons. Her aunt and uncle had not invited the Native American boy to her party, and Amelia was not sure what to do. To ignore his call was to ignore the friendship that they'd had since childhood, but she could not ask him to join them, for her family would not allow it. Hi, LMNW. We're reading about Edisto Island. This is spooky South Carolina. We're reading a story about the island that we were just on. Gathering up her skirts, she headed to the back door and slipped out into the twilight garden. Concha was admiring the cascading roses on the trellis when she came out to speak to him. He turned toward her with a smile, and then his dark eyes widened, and a stunned expression crossed his handsome face. Used to seeing Amelia with tousled hair and rumpled gown, he had never quite realized until that moment that she was a woman grown, and a very beautiful one. In the lantern light, which cascaded through the door behind her and haloed her lovely hair, she looked like an angel to the waiting man. I love that name, Amelia. My granddaughter. Her thumbprint with the A. And her tattoo. Just add sunshine. My girl. Amy, he gasped. Little flower. Hey, Tracy Claus? The look on Concha's face froze Amelia to the core. Concha was her friend. She loved him like a brother, but the expression on his face as he stared at her in the darkening garden said that he wanted more from her, much more. She took a step back, and he stepped forward quickly and caught both of her hands in his. Come away with me, Amy, Ammie, he calls her. He said, Amie, I don't know, towering above her slight form, dark and intense. Come and be my wife. We will live all our days in harmony with the woods and the water and the sky. No, Concha, Amelia gasped, pulling her hands from his grasp and hiding them behind her back. You are my friend, my brother, but I do not love you and will not marry you. His face twisted in pain, for she did not want to hurt her friend. Her face twisted in pain, for she did not want to hurt her friend, but Concha would have none of her protest. I want you, little flower, he cried, catching her around the waist with his strong hands. I cannot live without you. Amelia thrust her hands against her chest and pushed him away from her. I said no, Concha, she cried, twisting away and running back to the open door. Behind her, Concha called, I will wait for you. Amelia slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trembling. She was not exactly afraid, for this was Concha, who was like a brother to her, but she knew she could not return his affection. A wall had just come up between the friends that could not be breached. Amelia straightened herself and returned to her room to compose herself. She could hear guests arriving, and knew she would be obliged, to go downstairs to meet them as soon as she straightened her hair and caught her breath. In spite of its unfortunate beginning, the night of Amelia's birthday party was unforgettable. Paul Grimball, a handsome young bachelor, newly returned to Edisto Island from a tour of Europe, came to her debut party, and he was instantly bowled over by the beautiful young woman whom he had last seen as a grubby tomboy hanging out of a tree. Paul could scarcely take his eyes off Amelia, and she blushed and stammered under his admiring gaze. By the end of the evening, Amelia was head over heels in love, and Paul's heart would never be the same again. Thereafter, they were constant companions, riding and rowing and wandering in the garden hand in hand. It was not long before Paul approached Amelia's uncle to request her hand in marriage. There was much rejoicing over Amelia's pending nuptials, and the only blot on the girl's happiness came when she heard a familiar bird cry from the woods nearby. It was Concha calling to his old friend, but she did not answer. A month or so before the wedding, Paul was called away on business to Charlestown. Lonely and restless, Amelia went down to the sea to catch crabs. She laid several lines and was busy wading through the water, pulling in crabs, when a shadow from the bank blocked the sun. Startled, she looked up into the eyes of Concha. She faltered, and her foot came down sharply on the sharp edge of an oyster shell under the water. We know them oyster shells there. Amelia gave a sharp cry of pain as blood spurted up from her foot, coloring the water under her bundled up skirts. It's okay, Tracy. Yeah, you can just change it. You just hit like instead of dislike. Instantly, Concha leapt into the water and swept her up into his arms. Gently, he carried her to a grassy knoll under a nearby tree. Then he wiped away the blood and bound the wound as Amelia leaned back against the tree, feeling dizzy and rather sick to her stomach. After a few minutes, she became aware that Concha was cradling her injured ankle in his hands and staring at her intensely. I cannot live without you, Amelia. Don't marry him, he said, his voice calm and even. His calmness frightened her more than his passion had the night of her debut. She closed her eyes a moment against the pain of her ankle and the pain in her heart. She hated injuring her friend, but she loved Paul and always would. Oh, look at the illustration. Hello, Jody. Well, I'm glad you came in too to listen. And then look up in the tree. Look up there, guys. I love him, Concha, she said, opening her eyes and gazing on him with pity and compassion in her face. "We are going to be married. I'm sorry," she ended rather lamely. Concha's face hardened suddenly. He released her ankle and stood up. "Never will I let you go with another man, little flower," he said, his voice stern and full of resolve. Amelia felt her heart pound against her ribs, suddenly in fear. He looked so stern, so different from the friend she had known all of her life. She rose hastily, wanting to get away from him, but when she put her weight on the injured foot, she was overwhelmed with pain and nausea. Amelia gasped, clutched her stomach, and then straightened. "I am sorry, Concha," she said again, as firmly as she could, and tried to walk away, stumbling each time she put weight on her injured foot. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she wiped them away surreptitiously, not wanting her old friend to see her cry. Behind her, Amelia heard Concha curse under his breath. Then he picked her up and carried her home, her face remote and stern, his face remote and stern, his eyes turned away from her. Amelia didn't know what hurt her more, her ankle or the look on Concha's face. On the evening before their wedding, Amelia and Paul slipped away from their guests after the rehearsal dinner and strolled together in the moonlit garden. They stood holding one another among the flowers and the moss-draped trees, planning their life together and laughing softly with happiness. Neither of them noticed the rustling of the leaves in the tree above them. If Amelia felt a chill, she put it down to the breeze blowing in from the sea. The house was filled with family and friends on the night of the wedding. Amelia stood in her northwest bedroom, adjusting the filmy wedding veil that fell in misty folds over her dark hair. She was a picture of perfect beauty as she turned away from the mirror toward the door. She could hear the murmur of the guests' voices in the rooms below and knew her uncle awaited her at the bottom of the staircase to escort her to her groom. She smiled, straightened her already straight skirts, and moved toward the door. Outside her window, a familiar bird call sounded. Amelia's heart twisted when she heard the call, and she moved swiftly past the window, making no sign that she had heard Concha's summons. Suddenly, an arrow came singing through the open window and slammed into her breast. Amelia gave a piercing cry of shock and pain, staggering back one step, then two, as she clutched her hands to her bloody stained chest. She stared numbly down at the arrow sticking out from her body. In that moment, she had only one thought in her mind. She had to find Paul. They were going to be married. Paul was waiting for her. If she found Paul, everything would be all right. Her legs took over, walking her out the door toward the staircase. She was walking strangely, more of a stagger than a walk, but she couldn't think of that any more than she could think of the shaft sticking out of her chest. She had to find Paul. Find Paul. The whole world was dark around the edges as she groped for the railing of the staircase. Paul was downstairs. She had to go downstairs. She could hear gasps and cries and consternation from below, but she did not heed them. She only had one thought: find Paul. Then she heard a familiar, beloved voice give a shout of horror, and footsteps pounded up the staircase toward her. It was Paul. She had found Paul. Paul caught Amelia in his arms on the 13th step and eased her down as her blood cascaded over them both. She stared into his panic-stricken eyes and raised a bloody hand to touch his cheek, and then she died. The blood staining the 13th step, Amelia's blood, never came out, no matter how hard the maid scrubbed. Not then, not ever. And no one ever set foot on that stained step in the century that followed. before the brick house burnt to the ground. Only the brick walls of the house remain, and the ghost in the northwest window. She hovers there, shimmering in the dark night air, dressed in her bridal gown. Then the cry of a bird sounds from the woods nearby, and with a scream of agony, she disappears. That was sad. Hi, Vicky. Poor girl, right? Let's see, it's been 20 minutes. Okay, we got a few more. Let's do a couple more. Chapter 5, Tony. This is from John's Island. She jerked awake suddenly and looked around for Tony, but he wasn't there. That was strange. Where was he? She struggled out of the chair in which she had been dozing and searched the room for her husband. No, Tony wasn't there. Maybe he'd gone downstairs. She stepped out into the hallway calling, "Tony, Tony, Tony." There was no answer. She peered into first one room, then another on the second floor, calling for her missing spouse. No response. The upstairs maid, who was making the bed, did not look up when she poked her head into the master bedroom. She wondered if she should question the girl, but the maid was unfamiliar to her, so she continued on her way. As she wandered about, she found herself reminiscing about the day she met her husband. They were both so young back then. Her father was an important man who owned a big plantation on the island, and he had imported horses all the way from England for his stable. Among them, he told his indulged and much loved daughter was a thoroughbred racer. She was so excited she could hardly sleep the night before the horses arrived. She hurried down to the stable the next day as soon as she could and found the thoroughbred in the paddock with several other fine horses. A young man was holding the thoroughbred, which was prancing nervously. Hiya, Heart Made Wise. What is his name? She asked the young man. He is called Sultan, the young man replied. When she tore her gaze from the lovely horse, she found herself gazing into a pair of intense dark eyes that made her flush and look away. She wanted to ask the young man his name, but she was too shy. Then her father came up to the fence and called, "Take him into the stable, Tony," and the young man led the horse away. Tony, she had thought dreamily. His name is Tony. She came out of her reverie to find herself at the top of the stairs. Tony was still missing. Drat it, where was the man? Tony, 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 she called, making her way down the staircase. Her misty feet seemed to float down the steps as if they weren't there. There had been a time when walking down the steps had been difficult for her, but that seemed long ago. He thought his name was Fred. Let me get my sip of water. Cheers. She wandered to the front door, calling for her spouse. Still no answer. She gazed out the window, wondering if he'd gone outside. It was dark and stormy outside, and it seemed unlikely that he would venture outdoors. A flash of lightning lit the grounds. She stared into the tumult, watching the rain blowing against the glass of the window as thunder rumbled overhead, and she remembered another thunderstorm long ago. Scaring you, Tracy? Tony was the groom assigned to accompany her each day when she went out for her ride. He was an excellent horseman and an excellent companion. They talked and laughed, swapped stories, and shared their dreams as they rode all over the island together. But this time she was deeply in love, but she was unsure that her love was returned until the day they strayed too far on one of their rides and were caught out in a thunderstorm. They raced as fast as they could toward the plantation, but ended up taking shelter in one of the outbuildings. And that was where Tony kissed her for the first time. Ooh. She turned in annoyance. Where was he? She wandered toward the kitchen, calling his name. No answer. She hurried through the rest of the downstairs rooms, crying, Tony, Tony. Still no answer. She flopped down into a chair, as frustrated with her man as she ever got, which, to be honest, was not much. Tony could always charm her. Tony could always charm her with one flash of his dark eyes, and in an instant, all her ire would melt away. Let me talk to him, Tony said, when she told him that her father had forbidden the match. This is ridiculous. I am the younger son of a noble. Just because I must work for a living in America does not mean that socially we are not equals. I will have my father write to him. If he does not like my current profession, he can assist me in finding another. Oh, my love, I don't think that will work, she had sighed. And she was right. She was forbidden to see Tony, and another groom was assigned to ride with her. They had to meet in secret down by the stream, and it was not often she could get away from her watchful family. She had one more try at persuading her recalcitrant father that she should be married to Tony, but he was adamantly against it. And so she and Tony decided to elope. It was supper time. She was sure of it. Good smells were coming from the kitchen, and the people were bustling in and out, setting the table, arranging flowers in a vase. Tony was going to miss his dinner if he didn't emerge soon from his hideaway. She got up and wandered invisibly through the busy household. Tony, Tony, she called for her husband, but he wasn't there. They slipped away when her father was out of town and were married by a local minister. They were too late to catch a passing boatman when they reached the Ashley River. Never mind, love, Tony said. We can spend the night in a cabin and cross to Charlestown tomorrow. Charlestown must have later become Charleston, right, guys? I would think. Hi, Larky. Glad you came in. We're reading spooky stories from South Carolina. We just read one on Edisto Island where we were at. It was a small, damp cabin, not the ideal place to begin their married life together, but as long as Tony was with her, it was heaven. Snuggling down in the arms of her brand new husband, she fell asleep with a smile on her lips and awoke to the sound of horsemen outside the door and her father's angry roaring. ... She stopped at the foot of the staircase, her mouth suddenly dry. She didn't like remembering the next part of their story. It had not gone so well. She floated up the staircase on feet that didn't seem quite solid. Her head felt light, too, as if she were coming down with a cold. Tony, she called in sudden fear. Where are you, Tony? Suddenly it was imperative that she find her husband at once, if only to reassure herself that he was still well and whole and hadn't gone away. Her father's men had tied Tony's arms behind his back and thrust both of them into the coach. She had clung to her husband as they rode in silence back to the house. She tried to release his bonds, but the knots defeated her. Never mind, love, Tony said soothingly. We will sort things out when we get home. When they got home. The words made her tremble in apprehension. Her father was was a stern and demanding man who few dared to cross. She had no idea what he would do to them when they got home. This isn't looking too good, is it, guys? Panic ripped through her body as she raced through each room on the second floor and then back downstairs to look again on the first. Her heart thundered wildly in her chest as she shouted for her husband, Tony, Tony, Tony. But there was no answer. Her father's face was red with rage when he pulled her out of the coach. I am Tony's wife, she cried defiantly. We were married yesterday. There is nothing you can do about it now. Last night was our wedding night. Then she cried out in pain as her father twisted her arm behind her. Grim-faced, he nodded to his men and said, Put him on a horse. Tony, white-faced, stared deeply into her eyes for a moment as they dragged him out of the coach. No, she screamed as they flung a noose around his neck and sat him on the horse. And then her father grabbed a whip, forced it into her hand, and pulled her arm back. She fell to her knees on the floor of the east parlor, her body racked with sobs. For a moment, she saw once again the whip come down on the flank of the horse, saw it rear and leap away, saw her Tony plummet toward the ground, heard the dull snap of his neck as the noose closed around his throat. She covered her face with misty, transparent hands, but she still saw the floorboards right through them. Tony, she moaned softly as her ghostly body turned to mist and slowly faded away. Tony. The end. That's sad. Yes, march. It's a sad one. These have been sad so far. Hi, Karen H. Right? Very uplifting. Hi, Star Marie. Well, hopefully you'll go to sleep. Just lay back and listen. Okay? I'm going to read another one. Chapter 6, The Sentry. This one is in Georgetown, South Carolina. My husband is a golf nut. Every minute he can spare, Bill's out on the golf course. I learned a long time ago that if I ever wanted to see the man, I'd have to take up the game. I loved accompanying my husband to the local golf course, which inhabits the grounds of a plantation. The mansion is set in an expensive gardens that are lovely to stroll through at any time of the year. And the plantation has an exciting history, full of Tories and spies and Francis Marion, the fabled swamp fox of the Revolutionary War. It was a lovely Saturday in late spring when Bill suggested we call our best friends and play a round or two of golf, followed by dinner at the Plantation House restaurant, overlooking the 18th hole, which was surrounded by the brick remains of the original plantation house. Our plan was greeted with enthusiasm by Jim and Jill, and soon we were driving into the club beneath a canopy of moss-draped live oaks. Jim and Jill have an 8.5 handicap and a 21 handicap, respectively. They're a lovely pair, and we laughed and joked our way around the golf course, enjoying the coolness of the spring weather. Once summer came, it would be too hot for me to spend the day playing golf, though nothing deters my husband, who'd, who'd play with the devil in Hades if that was the only game going. One of the things I liked best about the course was the way each hole was set off on its own, so we were not hitting into somebody else's fairway. The holes were routed around the swamp and marshland that made up the old rice plantation. It was a very peaceful place to play. Bill likes the course because there are trees pinching the sides of fairways and a number of ponds interspersed throughout the layout, which put a premium on his accuracy. The course was really tough for big hitters, as water hazards were placed in strategic landing areas. Not that I minded the water hazards, though I lost more than one ball to them. After losing my second ball, I paused to watch several ducks swimming on a pond off the 14th hole. I don't think Bill even saw the ducks. He was too busy setting up his next shot. However, we all paused for a moment to gaze at the lovely plantation house as we walked toward the 18th green. The breeze was blowing in from the coast, bringing with it the salty tang of the sea, and the setting seemed to have sprung to life from an old Southern novel, minus the green, of course. I guess you're not, Amy. Enjoy, lay back and rest. Maybe you'll fall asleep. Bill trounced us all, as is his wont. But we didn't care. The restaurant beckoned, and I was ready for a splendid meal after all that walking. We're talking about this is all in South Carolina where we were on vacation, Amy. Bill trounced us all, as is his wont, but we didn't care. The restaurant beckoned, and I was ready for a splendid meal after all that walking. We lingered over an early dinner and then parted at the door, Jill and Jim to an evening party, and Bill and I for a romantic stroll through the extensive gardens surrounding the mansion. It was growing dark, but there was still plenty of light left to enjoy the gardens. As we meandered through the romantic setting, I regaled my husband with some of the revolutionary history surrounding the plantation. During the 1760s, a 2.5-story manor house was built here to replace a smaller cottage. The owner of the plantation was a wealthy businessman who worked behind the political scenes both in Georgetown and Charleston. He often entertained business and political associates at the manor house, influential men who came from other colonies and abroad. When war broke out between America and England, the owner was reluctant to take sides, for his business was primarily supported by England. Not so his family, who were actively engaged in the revolution. Buffering, really? Is it really buffering? Is it buffering? Oh, okay. All right. Okay, good. The plantation owner did not stay on the fence for long, though. When the British occupied Georgetown and made it a stronghold and supply base for their military operations, he declared himself a Tory, much to the wrath of his family, who labeled him a traitor. His daughter in particular was angered by his stance, for she was strictly loyal to the colonies. Still, she kept a low profile since she was living in her father's house and became a spy for General Francis Marion. It was due to the girl's alertness and the information that she gathered and furnished for the swamp fox that so many of the general's exploits met with success. The family owned a house in Georgetown that adjoined the cemetery of Prince George Church, and it was in a vault in that cemetery that the girl spy left messages, and one of those messages contained vital information about a prisoner of war who was being held at the plantation. The prisoner was an old fellow, father to one of the trusted men in Marion's brigade, who had been present when many of the plans and strategies for some of the local operations had been formulated. Due to his age and infirmity, the swamp fox was afraid that the old man might unknowingly furnish the enemy with damaging information in a moment of confusion. It was vitally important that he be rescued and taken beyond the reach of his captors. The girl spy had arranged to visit the plantation to obtain supplies for her townhouse, though her real aim was to locate the old man. She found him lodged in the plantation house, along with his wife and several wounded soldiers. In order to give Marion and his men time to retrieve the prisoner, the girl had the soldiers guarding the plantation invited to a reception at a neighboring estate. There was only one sentry left on guard that evening, but the swamp fox and his men came thundering down the avenue of the plantation. The sentry, thinking they were British soldiers arriving from town, ran down the steps to greet them. The Americans were almost upon him when the sentry recognized Marion's men. He fired his pistol at the nearest horseman, who was already aiming at him. Both shots missed, but a saber-wielding cavalryman promptly cut off the sentry's head, leaving his body to stagger around, spouting blood like a decapitated chicken before it fell twitching to the ground amidst a growing pool of gore. The prisoners were retrieved and taken back to Marion's camp, along with the wounded British and Tory soldiers housed at the plantation, who were held as prisoners of war. As for the headless sentry, he was buried in the garden near the old plantation house. He's probably buried right here somewhere, I finished my tale, waving my arm to indicate the twilight garden. That's pretty gruesome, said my husband. This remark comes, mind you, from the man who dresses up as a vampire every Halloween and jumps out at the trick-or-treaters from the bushes by the front porch. Another drink. Before I could summon up a retort, we heard a sudden thunder of hooves coming toward us from somewhere along the old avenue. Bill and I glanced at each other questioningly. It was a little late for anyone to be out on horseback, and surely they didn't allow horses to ride on the golf course. We hurried toward the sound, baffled and intrigued. What was going on? Bill was a little ahead of me. He rounded a corner of the mansion and reeled back suddenly, swearing, his arms held up protectively in front of his face. I was alarmed. Bill, what's wrong? I gasped. And then I saw it. Tottering towards us, glowing blue-white in the dusk, was a headless man, dressed in the clothes of an 18th century British dragoon. The ghastly, ragged stump where its neck ended was spouting blood, and it waved a pistol aimlessly in its right hand. The phantom staggered right towards us, and ectoplasmic blood cascaded over Bill and me as we leapt out of his path, out of his way, one on either side of the path. What is ectoplasmic? The places where the ghostly blood landed on my body burned with a cold fire that made me gasp in pain. The blood melted right through my skin, and I felt coldness cascading through my whole body as it entered my bloodstream. I went rigid for a moment as ghostly images flashed before my eyes. In a split second, I relived the man's last moments: boredom, eagerness at the sound of hooves, anger at the sight of the Americans, anger as he shot the pistol, and the finally shock of a split second pain as his head was lopped off. I came back to myself to find the headless man swaying right in front of me. I gasped in fear. I desperately did not want the gruesome thing to touch me. I threw myself under a nearby bush and watched as it dragged itself down the path. I think it was searching for its head. That's unpleasant. Yeah, just a little. There they are on the golf course. And they see the headless soldier. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, another cheery story. Oh, I wonder who found his head. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the specter vanished, and twilight fell over the garden again. Almost at once, I heard Bill frantically calling my name. I jumped up and waved to him, and he crashed right through a flower bed and grabbed me into his arms. When you disappeared, I thought that thing had caught you, he gasped, his voice muffled in my neck. I'm fine, I reassured him, stroking his hair with trembling hands. I was lying, of course. I was numb with terror, and I wanted out of that garden so bad. I could hardly keep from tearing out of Bill's arms and bolting for the car. Bill must have sensed my agitation, for he raised his head suddenly from my shoulder and said, "Let's get out of here." We ran all the way to the car, and Bill broke every speed limit on the way home. We probably should have talked over the incident, but neither of us could frame a coherent sentence during the short but tense journey home. As we pulled into our driveway, Bill just said, "We both saw the ghost, right? I'm not crazy?" And I said, "Yes, we both saw him. You're not crazy." And that was it. After that day, Bill lost his enthusiasm for the golf course at the plantation, and we rarely went there again. And, it must be noted, Bill would only play golf there in the morning. Let's see how long, 48 minutes. I love these emojis. A ghost goo is ghost goo. Remember, that's what they called slime on. Oh, that's right. A heart made wise. Yes, yes. Okay, chapter 7. We're still in South Carolina. This is spooky South Carolina. Carolyn's sleeping, so she's missing this. She may not want to go back there after these stories. Could you imagine if I had been reading these while we were there? I wish I would have. I didn't even think about it. Okay. The Gray Lady from Camden, South Carolina. This looks like it's a letter. It says, it's addressed, "My young friend, comma. There is not a person in this wide world who has not, in their lifetime, met with some tragedy. Yet this fact, true as it may be, does not make the dealing with said tragedy any easier, in spite of the universality of the occurrence. I have watched as you struggle valiantly to deal with the pain that has befallen you. In your eyes, I see loneliness when others fail to understand the torment that you suffer. Because of this, I have decided to break my long silence, hoping that the story of my own tragedy of losing a beloved one too soon will comfort you in some way. For if you are not alone, there is one in your circle of acquaintance who understands the burden you carry. His name was Raoul de Sarin, and he was tall and dark and handsome and debonair. Do you smile at my description? That was how I perceived him when we first met, and how I remember him still. Yes, I toppled headlong into love with a dashing young man of French descent whose family owned property here in Camden. Raoul had all the charm of his French forebears and was named after a many times grandfather who escaped from the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1857. Yes, we were at Edisto Island. We already read a story on that. That's where we were, Amy, in which a targeted group of assassinations was directed against the Huguenots during the French Wars of Religion. I was young and inexperienced, and it was my first season. I loved Raoul from the moment we met, but I thought he was merely flirting with me, for I considered myself rather plain and without any of the vivacious small talk that characterized the other debutantes. Whenever Raoul spoke to me at the assemblies and danced with me at the balls, I put it down to gallantry, though I blossomed under his praise and treasured every remark, reviewing his words in my mind before I went to sleep each night. I was taken completely by surprise when he proposed marriage. To me, it seemed an impossible dream that this man should love me. You will laugh when I say that the first words out of my mouth were, "Be serious, Raoul." It took the poor man 10 minutes of fast talking to persuade me that he meant what he said. It wasn't until I looked deeply in his eyes and saw the love burning in their depths that I realized that the impossible was true. Raoul loved me. Our engagement was a source of constant amazement and joy to me and my whole family. Shortly after it was announced, Raoul invited us to visit his family at their home, which was called Lausanne. I was very nervous. I had met his parents several times, but never had any extended conversation with them, and I wished to make a good impression during my stay. It was not long after we arrived at Lausanne that we inquired about an old portrait depicting a 16th century woman that graced one of the walls downstairs. Raoul's face clouded when he looked at the picture, and his voice shook a little when he said that her name was Eloise de Sarin, also known as the Gray Lady. Of course, we'd heard rumors about the Gray Lady, who was said to haunt the de Sarin family, and we asked Raoul to tell us the story. It took some persuading, but Raoul finally told the following tale. In life, the Gray Lady was called Eloise de Sarin. She fell in love with a Protestant, and her father, a devout Catholic, forbade the match and sent her to live in a convent. Eloise died 14 months later. Her spirit appeared to her father shortly after her demise, and her guilt-stricken father took his own life after the visitation. Later, when her brothers Jules and the first Raoul de Sarin were caught up in the tragic events of St. Bartholomew's Day, the ghost of Eloise appeared to her siblings, bringing them monks' robes in which to disguise themselves so they might escape the slaughter. Tragically, Jules was persecuted with the other Huguenots, but Raoul escaped thanks to his disguise. Every generation of the de Sarin family had at least one visitation from the Gray Lady from the 1500s to the present day, and her visits have always heralded tragedy. As Raoul finished speaking, a chill went down my spine. I must have turned pale, for he laughed a little and kissed me soundly. It's only a story, love, just a tale to tell around the fire on stormy nights, he said. But something in his tone belied his statement. I sensed that he believed in the ghost, in spite of his reassuring words. I put the gray lady out of my mind and then concentrated on enjoying the evening, happy just to be near my beloved Raoul. But as I prepared for bed that night, the cold feeling returned, and I remembered the story of the gray lady with dread. Impulsively, I threw on my wrapper and grabbed the candle by my bedside. Raoul's sister, Lucia, Lucia had a room down the hall. I would speak to Lucia. She was a practical girl, and she would tell me such superstition was nonsense. We would laugh together over my jitters, and I would feel better, and then I would be able to sleep. Such were my thoughts as I slipped out of my room and walked down the shadowy hall, candle uplifted to light my way. I had nearly reached Lucia's door when a woman dressed in gray appeared suddenly at the far end of the hall. She came toward me, wringing her hands in agitation, and I nearly dropped the candle, for she looked exactly like the portrait downstairs. My eyes met those of the gray lady, and ice seemed to fill my body, beginning on my legs and swiftly rising through my torso and into my heart. Chills ran down my arms and pricked the tiny hairs at the back of my neck. Hi, Sammy. I stood frozen in space and time, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then she vanished, and I was gazing blankly at the wall. With a muffled shriek, I flew back to my chamber and barred myself inside. But I did not sleep that night. I huddled under the covers, my body numb with fear and dread for what the new day might bring. Let me get another sip. Okay, yeah, it's going to be 3 in the morning. So when this one's done, that'll be it for the night. As soon as the gray light of dawn filtered through the window, I dressed and hurried downstairs. Raoul and the men were already gathered, for they were scheduled to hunt that day. I pulled Raoul aside and begged him not to go, becoming almost incoherent when I tried to describe the ghost I'd seen in the upstairs hallway. Several of the men overheard my remarks and made jokes about women's sensibilities, which I did not appreciate. Raoul hushed them and kissed me tenderly, reassuring me that he would be back in a few hours. And then he was gone, and I watched through the window as the men rode away, fear making my whole body tremble and the curtain shake in my hand. Hi, Christine. What can I say, my young friend? I knew in that moment that I would never see my Raoul alive again. When the writers returned a few hours later, Raoul's body was tethered to the top of his horse. He had been accidentally shot by one of the other hunters. I am an old woman now, but the moment I ran out to meet the hunters and, and saw my perfect Raoul lying dead on his horse is etched forever in my heart, a pain that time has not eased. But I know Raoul would not wish me to remember him thus, and so I concentrate on the happy moments when we were dancing and when he took me in his arms and kissed me. And I know we will meet again someday, as you will meet your beloved in time. Be brave, my young friend, and know that you are not alone in your grief. There are those of us who understand. Your sincere and affectionate friend, Nina. So whoever she wrote this to is going to lose somebody, aren't they? Hey, it's Pink. Hi, Justice Janny. Nice to see you. Okay, guys, thank you for coming. If you want to hear the stories, you can hit replay if you would like. Lay back and enjoy, and hopefully you'll fall asleep. I'm going to go to sleep now. Okay, guys, thanks for coming. Good night.